Hello, and welcome back to our podcast. I'm the Disturbed Southern Belle.
And I'm the gentleman.
On this episode, we're going to continue on to talking about some of the most disturbing experiments that have been performed on humans throughout history. And we're going to be talking about one that is somewhat widely known, but some people probably maybe have never heard of it. And it's Unit 731. So we'll just say this. World War II was an interesting time for human experiments, not only with the Nazis, because this one is going to involve the Japanese army. And let's just say it definitely rivals the Nazis.
Oh, grand. Because the Nazis had some really interesting
They
ones.
definitely did. And this one was no better, if not worse. So, Unit 731 was also known as the Manchu Detachment 731, the Camo Detachment, and the Ishii Unit. And it was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. So the unit engaged in numerous lethal human experiments and biological weapons manufacturing during both the Second Sino-Japanese War and the World War II. So the exact number of deaths that happened here is not known, but it's estimated to be somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people died in this unit in just a very short amount of time as well. Though sadly, these numbers could be much higher. We really don't know. So the unit was established in 1936 and was responsible for some of the most heinous war crimes ever to be committed by the Japanese armed forces. So the people that were tested on were dehumanized, and they were referred to as logs. And they were confined in these facilities that were known as log cabins. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the experiments that were performed, and then we're going to get into some more detail here in a bit. But anyway, some of the experiments that were performed include injecting them with different diseases, controlled dehydration, biological weapon testing, hypobaric pressure chamber testing, vivisection, organ harvesting, amputation, and standard weapon testing. And as you can imagine, most of all this was done while these people were fully aware and alive, even the vivisections. They would cut them open while they were completely alive, no anesthesia, and everything.
Yeah, that sounds about right for that side of the war.
Right.
Then again, it wouldn't surprise me if it comes out that America has some similar experiments.
Who knows? So
humans are capable of some awful stuff.
Definitely. Very much so. So the victims of the unit were normally people who were just simply kidnapped, and they could include men, women, including pregnant women and children. And sadly, some babies were born due to the systematic, we'll say SA, that the women would endure from the staff inside the compound. And these babies also became test subjects. The vast majority of the victims were Chinese. However, there were also Russian test subjects, and the unit produced biological weapons that were used in areas of China that were not occupied by Japanese forces, which also included Chinese cities, towns, their water sources, and fields. So they would send these, and we'll talk about it later, all the things that they did, but it was pretty horrific. So all the prisoners that were kept within the compound were killed to conceal all the evidence of the horrible attacks that, and different things that took place in there. The facilities that was used for the horrendous experimentation was built in 1935 as a replacement for the Zonggoma Fortress, which was a prison and experimentation camp, and it was eventually taken over by a man named General Shiro Ishii, who was a combat medic officer, and he then ran it until the end of World War II. Now, the programs that were used at the facility were generously supported by the Japanese government during this time, so they got a lot of money to do this stuff, and it was very supported. Both the United States and the Soviet Union gathered data from the unit after the fall of Japan, and 12 researchers were arrested by Soviet forces and were tried in December of 1949, where they were sentenced to the Siberian labor camp for 2 to 25 years. The sentence that was given was lighter due to an agreement for a lesser sentence in exchange for sharing information they had about the unit and the experimentation that they did. The Soviet Union used the information gathered to help build a bioweapons facility, and the U.S. secretly gave immunity to the researchers who were captured, and also the Harry S. Truman administration helped to cover up the acts that were committed, as well as handing out stipends to the perpetrators.
Jeez.
So, yeah. So this was done supposedly in an effort to gain information and also to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining access to more data. However, it said that the information that the U.S. gathered from the people that they had captured wasn't of any real particular use, as the United States Biological Warfare Program had already surpassed the capabilities of the unit by 1943, so they didn't really even get anything from them, but whatever. So, the facilities that were used contained more than just medical research and experimentation areas. Some buildings were used for detaining victims, so it was essentially operated as a prison as well. And it expanded over time and grew large enough to allow for over 3,000 staff members on 150 structures, and it also had the capacity to detain approximately 600 prisoners at one time. So
well, that is terrifying.
It is. Now, of course, as these people died out, they just brought more in, and it just, they just recycled. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the experiments. So the ones responsible for gathering and finding victims were the military police and the Special Services Agency. And there was also a group of physicians who were responsible for maintaining healthy victims and dispatching them for experimentation. Not everyone who was sent to the unit was used for experiment, as this was normally only done to individuals who were deemed healthy. Once they were accepted as a specimen, the preservation of their health also became a top priority, so they would try to keep them alive as long as possible so that they could torture them, I guess, for as long as possible. During some of these experiments that were conducted, victims would be intentionally injected with diseases, exposed to special bombs that were designed to disperse infectious substances upon contact with the skin, and there were no records that ever indicate that there was anyone who ever survived that was a prisoner. Those who did not perish from the experiments were later killed so that autopsies could be performed, and the most common method of execution was either to use chloroform injections or to make them drink or eat something that had potassium cyanide in it.
Jesus Christ, this is awful.
It is. So, an American historian by the name of Sheldon H. Harris wrote, "The Togo unit employed gruesome tactics to secure specimens of select body organs. If Ishii or one of his co-workers wished to do research on the human brain, they would then order the guards to find them a useful sample. A prisoner would be taken from his cell, guards would hold him, while another guard would smash the victim's head open with an axe. His brain would be extracted off to the pathologist and then the crematorium for the usual disposal." And this happened all the time.
Yeah, I can imagine. This just seems so awful.
And it was just, everything was just fine. So there was a man named Nakagawa Yonizo who studied at Kyoto University and later became a professor at Osaka University, and he watched footage of the human experimentation and executions that had taken place at Unit 731. He later went on to testify about what he described as the playfulness of what he witnessed. He stated some of the experiments had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare or medicine. There is such a thing as professional curiosity, such as what would happen if we did such and such, or what medical purpose was served by performing and studying the beheadings, but of course there was none at all. They were just playing around. Professional people, too, like to play. So, yeah, they were studying supposedly beheadings. What would be the medical? I don't know. Prisoners were injected what they were told were vaccinations, but they were, of course, actually were diseases. And, of course, they would also try to study the effects of untreated venereal diseases, which men and women were deliberately infected with syphilis and gonorrhea, and then studied as they just allowed the disease to run rampant through their bodies. There was a special project that was codenamed Maruta, and in these like I said, this was the special project that was going on. It was a codenamed Maruta, and in this study, victims, of course, like we said, were gathered from the surrounding population. They were referred to as logs. Now, supposedly that term originated as sort of a joke. Initially, the facility operated under the cover story of being a lumber mill. So if you heard a staff member say something like how many logs fell, an outsider wouldn't really truly understand the dark undertones of what they meant.
Yeah, I don't imagine so, considering how
they were
just much
people.
Of an inside reference it is.
Right. So researchers at the facility further dehumanized their victims and published results that were printed in peer-reviewed journals in which they stated that the experiments were conducted on non-human primates that they called Manchurian monkeys or long-tailed monkeys.
So, well, all right then.
Exactly. Now, there was people, but they were saying that that's what it was. So we're going to talk a little bit about the vivisections. So thousands of men, women, and children and infants were subjected to this. These surgeries were most often done without any anesthesia, and as imagined, were more often than not lethal. In a later video interview, a former member of the unit admitted to having performed a vivisection on a pregnant woman. So, yeah. So they even admitted that, they did it to pregnant women, everything. While they were alive, and if anyone doesn't know what a vivisection is, it's basically where they just cut you open and look at your organs, or they can remove organs, and it's disgusting. So researchers would often remove organs from victims in order to further investigate the effects of various diseases on them. Victims would also have their limbs amputated, supposedly to study blood loss. They would sometimes take the amputated limbs and reattach them to a person's body. However, this would usually be done by sewing it to the opposite side from which it had been taken off of. Because why wouldn't it, right?
Yeah.
Some had their stomachs surgically removed and then had their esophagus reattached directly to their intestines. Others had parts of their organs, such as their brains, lungs, and livers, removed. And it was estimated approximately 1,000 Japanese personnel from the unit were involved in these vivisections and surgical experiments, and an army surgeon named Ken Yuasa was among those who participated in these atrocities. He later stated that the vivisections were all for practice rather than for research.
I feel unclean just knowing about this.
I know.
This just gives me such an awful feeling of ick just straight down my spine.
It does.
Just knowing that I share a species with these just psychopaths.
Right. He also stated that the practices were routine among the Japanese doctors who had been stationed in China during the war. Now, the New York Times interviewed a former member of the unit who had insisted on remaining anonymous. Gee, I wonder why. In the interview, he recounted his first experience in which he participated in a vivisection on a human. The victim had been infected with the plague in order to help in the development of plague bombs for the war. So he stated that the fellow knew it was all over for him, and so he didn't struggle when they let him into the room and tied him down. But when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and he screamed terribly, and his face was twisted in agony. He made this unimaginable sound. He was screaming so horribly, but then he finally stopped. That was all in a day's work for the surgeon, but it really left an impression on me because it was my first time.
Jesus.
But how matter of fact he's talking about. I mean,
I know, it's
crazy.
Just all awful. There's no good about this. It's just,
Now, there's several sources state that it was regular practice to put something in the victim's mouth to help stifle the screams, but...
like a leather strap or something, I'm assuming?
Yeah, a rag, something, just stuff something in their mouth.
Yeah.
But whatever.
It doesn't make it any better.
It doesn't make it any better. No, it doesn't. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the biological warfare. So by 1939, Ishii had concentrated his efforts on 6 pathogens mainly, and that was anthrax, typhoid, paratyphoid, glanders, dysentery, and the bubonic plague. So all winners right off the bat.
Oh, yeah.
So these ones that he developed, they were robust enough to ignite an epidemic of considerable magnitude, and they were also resilient to air dispersal, so they could be sprayed like a vapor or whatever out. So the experiments also involved the development of biodegradable bombs in which, now this is crazy, inside these bombs were housed live rats and fleas that were infected with varying diseases. The bombs were then designed to explode midair in order to ensure that the safe defense of the infected creatures. He also deployed birds and feathers that were contaminated with anthrax from low-flying aircrafts. In 1940 and 1941, plague-infected fleas were spread by low-flying airplanes over several Chinese cities, because why not? In an expedition to Nanjing, typhoid and paratyphoid germs were placed in wells, marshes, and various houses around the city. It was also placed in snacks that were then distributed to locals. Epidemics, of course, began to break out shortly thereafter, which elated the researchers. They also concluded that the paratyphoid fever was the most effective. Now, paratyphoid is not as bad as typhoid, but it's not a good thing. You don't want it, basically. So Ishii eventually determined that fleas were an efficient carrier for transmitting the plague and led the unit to breed a significant number of the insects. The unit had approximately 4,500 flea incubators, each of which was able to produce at least 45 kilograms, which would be around 100 pounds of fleas every cycle. So just a few, right?
Oh, yeah, just a handful.
100 pounds of fleas every cycle, and he had 4,500 of these flea incubators that could do that. Food items were the preferred delivery method for bacterial pathogens like typhoid. It was introduced into melons and cantaloupes, and after the food was contaminated, it was then measured for its bacterial density. And once this had reached what they considered an acceptable level, it was distributed to small groups of prisoners so that the spreading of the disease could be studied. So they would give it to people, they would get infected, and then they'd watch them spread it to other people. Biological warfare field trials were conducted on many Chinese civilian populations. Researchers had discovered that using bacterial bombs was not effective. However, they found success in using planes to spray the pathogens, so they figured out that the bombs weren't working, but they could just spray the stuff over people, and it was fine. So there were at least 12 large-scale bioweapon field trials that were conducted, and at least 11 Chinese cities were attacked with biological agents. One attack in 1941 reportedly led to roughly 10,000 biological casualties of civilians and approximately 1,700 ill-prepared Japanese troops that were in the area that they just allowed to be contaminated as well. In December of 1944, the Japanese Navy explored the possibility of attacking cities in California with biological weaponry. Now, this was known as Operation PX or Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, which is a lovely name considering what they're talking about doing, and you're going to hear what they're talking about doing, and then we're going to do this in California. So the plan involved using siren aircraft, which are these float planes that are ejected from submarine aircraft carriers. These planes would be launched specifically on the cities San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco especially. They were going to target these cities, not to say they weren't going to hit any of the smaller cities, but these were the main ones they were going to focus on because they were highly populated, of course, and very densely populated. So, once deployed, these planes would spread the bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, and the dengue fever. So, then the submarines would then run ashore in a suicide-type mission. The plan was finalized on March 26, 1945, but was shelved shortly after due to opposition from the Chief of General Staff, Yoshiri Umezu. Now, he later explained his decision by saying if bacteriological warfare is conducted, it will grow from the dimension of war between Japan and America to an endless battle of humanity against bacteria, and Japan will earn the derision of the world. Well, I wonder why. Because, yeah, it would definitely grow past that because, of course, it would spread. I mean, it's awful. So humans were used as also test subjects for, like I said earlier, weapons. So they were used to test grenades, and they would basically throw grenades at people, just see what would happen. They would put them at various distances away from how far that, they were throwing them. And they would also have them in varying positions and various cover, so to speak, and things like that. They tested flamethrowers on people in very much the same manner. They would have them at various distances and then test to see what would happen if they just opened fire on someone with a flamethrower. Victims were tied to stakes so that pathogen-releasing bombs, chemical weapons, shrapnel bombs, which had varying amounts of fragments within, and explosive bombs could be tested, as well as them testing bayonets and knives. So they really tested every weapon that was possible. They didn't just test a few, they went all out. And they basically tied people to stakes and just went at them with whatever. Grenades, bayonets, knives, shrapnel bombs, whatever. So described later in Unit 731, Nightmare in Manchuria, it was said, to determine the best course of treatment for varying degrees of shrapnel wounds sustained on the field by Japanese soldiers, Chinese prisoners were exposed to direct bomb blasts. They were strapped unprotected to wooden planks that were staked in the ground at increasing distances around a bomb that was detonated. It was surgery for most, autopsies for the rest.
Yeah, that's about accurate.
So basically, it was just cutting these people all to pieces.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like to me.
Now, here's another good guy that was involved in this, and this is Army engineer Hisato Yoshimura. So he conducted these frostbite experiments, which right off the bat sounds great.
Yep.
So he would do this in all different ways. He would take captives outside, where it was like really cold for extended periods of time. He would dip their victims' limbs into like water and allow them to freeze. Then once the limbs were frozen, he would then strike it with a short stick, and he liked how it sounded like a piece of wood or something when he struck it, like their arms or legs that were frozen. He thought that was interesting. Military personnel in the unit. Now, this tells you how bad this guy was, considering the fact of all the stuff these military personnel are in themselves being involved in. They referred to him as a scientific devil or a cold-blooded animal.
To be fair, I think that description could fit just about anyone in this story.
That's what I'm saying. So the fact that they inside were referring to him as that tells you he was pretty bad.
Yeah.
Now, this was supposed to be due to his strictness and his personal involvement in mass killings, along with his horrific experiments like the frostbite testing and things. One of these tests he even did included placing the fingers of a 3-day-old infant into a glass of ice water mixed with salt, which was at 0 degrees Celsius.
That's
3-day-old
awful.
baby. So, in an interview during the 80s, a former member of the unit described an atrocious scene that involved Yoshimura, in which he stated 2 naked men were put in an area that was approximately 40 to 50 degrees below zero, with researchers filming the entire incident while the subjects suffered and died. The subjects had suffered such agony that they were digging their nails into each other's flesh.
Jesus Christ, this is awful.
Now, you would think this would be someone who would be very remorseful about these types of things and want forgiveness, but Yoshimura supposedly had no remorse for his actions, which was supposedly even made more evident in an article he wrote for the Japanese Journal of Physiology in 1950. In the article, he admitted to using at least 20 children and the 3-day-old infant in his experiments, which exposed them to 0 degrees Celsius ice and salt water. And the article, even though it drew criticism, he denied any guilt. When later he was contacted by a reporter, he said he wasn't guilty of anything wrong. So,
well, all right then.
So now we're going to talk
Well.
about some things that are kind of bad, but I'm going to try to word them in a way where they don't sound as horrible as they are. So we'll just say that there were acts that were forced between prisoners who were infected with syphilis so that they could pass it among each other. And we know that syphilis is a venereal disease, so you can imagine how it's passed.
Yeah.
So they would basically figure out, they were described by staff, it's like the infection of venereal disease by injection was abandoned, and researchers started forcing the prisoners into acts with each other. And basically what would happen is 4 or 5 members dressed in white laboratory clothing that completely covered the body with only their eyes and mouth visible would handle the subjects, which would be a male and a female, one of whom would be infected with syphilis, and they'd be brought into a cell and forced into an act, and it was made clear that anyone who would resist it would be shot. So, yeah.
Jesus.
Then the infected victims were subjected to vivisection at varying stages of the disease so their internal organs could be observed as the disease progressed.
It's just getting worse and worse and worse.
It gets no better. Many female prisoners were forced to become impregnated so that they could be used for experimentation. And this was done by staff members, and it was also done by other prisoners. It didn't matter. They were just forced into these acts, and you know what that's called. So such is the study of how they like to study how a disease would pass from a mother to a baby. Women were also most often to be subjected to numerous experiments, while male prisoners were most often used in a single study. Women were sometimes subjected to not only bacteriological, but physiological and sexual experiments. Now, this one is another one that we talked about, but here's a little more into depth on this. There were also tests that would deprive people of food and water to determine how long they could survive. Others were placed in low-pressure chambers until their eyes would pop from their sockets. Other experiments included hanging victims upside down, to see how long they would last before they perished, placing victims in centrifuges and spinning them around and around and around until they died, crushing victims with heavy objects, electrocuting victims, exposing victims to lethal doses of X-rays, injecting victims with animal blood, and it was most often horse blood, but like it matters, injecting victims with seawater, burying or burning victims alive, among many, many other things that they did. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about these dehydration experiments that were performed. And in these experiments, basically, victims would be given no water or very little water, and then they were studied as they suffered and eventually passed away. In a later writing, it was stated that a small number of men, women, and children were also mummified alive in these experiments, in which they were placed in front of fans that blew out this hot, dry air, and they would essentially sweat, and they were given no water until they would weigh only 1/5 of their initial body weight. So, yeah. The unit also tested several different chemical agents, even having a building that was dedicated to gas experiments. And in this, they tested things like mustard gas, cyanic acid gas, white phosphorus, and phosphagen gas. Phosphagen gas, rather. Now, none of these are good at all, so
Sure sounds like it.
they are horrible. I don't know if anyone's ever saw what like a white phosphorus grenade can do to the body. Just that, it's bad. So, in a later testimony, a former Army major gave anonymous testimony in which he stated, in 1943, I attended a poison gas test held at the Unit 731 test facilities. A glass-walled chamber about 3 meters square and 2 meters high was used, and inside of it, a Chinese man was blindfolded with his hands tied around a post behind him. The gas, atomsite, which was known as sneezing or vomiting gas, was filled into the chamber, and the man went into violent coughing convulsions and began to suffer excruciating pain. He says that there was more than 10 doctors and technicians that were present, and after he watched for about 10 minutes, he couldn't stand it anymore, and he left the area, but he knew that they also tested several other types of gases in there as well. They also used these portable gas chambers that resemble phone booths, so, why wouldn't they? So that they could, take it on the move. They also did these field studies, and one such experiment took place between September 7th and 10th in 1940. And in this study, there were 20 subjects who were divided into 3 groups, and they were placed in locations like trenches and gazebos and whatever, and they were going to study what would happen if they hit them with rounds of mustard gas. Okay, so the first group was clothed in these, what they described as Chinese underwear. So I don't know exactly what they wore, but very little clothing, right? And they were subjected to, how many do you think? 1, 2 rounds of mustard gas, right? Is that it? No. 1,800 filled gun rounds of mustard gas were shot at these men over a time span of just over 25 minutes.
Yeah, that sounds about accurate.
Another group was clothed in summer military uniforms and shoes, and they were exposed to around 4,800 rounds. The general symptoms were then observed. So damage to victims' eyes, skin, and respiratory organs, and their digestive organs was observed at 4 hours, then 24 hours, 2 days, 3 days, and 5 days after to see what happened to them. Now, this part right here is actually very sad because this is going to tell you what exactly happened. So there's an excerpt from one of the reports that states, okay, now here's what it says. It was stated, number 376 dug out of the first area. September 7th, 1940, 6 p.m. Now, this is descriptions of how they wrote the victims looked. Tired and exhausted, looks with hollow eyes, weeping redness of the skin and upper part of the body, eyelids swollen. Then on September 8th, 6 a.m., neck, breast, and upper abdomen and their scrotum weeping, reddened and swollen, covered with millet-sized to bean-sized blisters, had difficulty opening the eyes. September 8th at 6 p.m., tired and exhausted, feels sick, mucus and bloody erosions across the shoulder girdle, abundant mucus nose secretions, abdominal pain, mucus and bloody diarrhea. September 9th at 7 a.m., tired and exhausted, weakness of all 4 extremities, low morale, skin of the face still weeping.
Jesus, this is just so
It
depressing, so
is.
sad, and so disgusting all at once.
It is. So, after Japan was defeated in World War II, every single prisoner that had been left in the unit was killed. Their remains were then cremated and buried around the unit's grounds, and the following testimony describes how some of the victims were dispatched. So it says on August 11th and 12th, after the end of the war, approximately 300 prisoners were still left and then were disposed of. The prisoners were coerced into ending their time on Earth by giving a piece of rope. So the first thing they did was give them a piece of rope and tried to get them to do it themselves. So approximately a quarter of the prisoners took them up on their offer and did that.
Unfortunately, I can't say I would do any different.
I don't say that I blame them at this point. And the remaining 3/4 who were left were then made to drink potassium cyanide or they were killed by injection. In the end, they were all taken care of. The prisoners were made to drink potassium cyanide by mixing it with water and putting it in a bowl, and the injections were mostly chloroform.
Jeez.
No one that entered Unit 731 as a prisoner reportedly ever exited again alive. Prisoners were normally received at night in motor vehicles that were painted black that had this ventilation hole placed in them but no windows. The vehicle would pull up to this main gate, and this guard would telephone what was known as the special team so that they were aware of them arriving, and then they would be transported via this secret tunnel that had been dug under the facade of the central building. So, all kind of sus right there, but anyway.
Yeah.
Once inside, technicians would then take samples from the prisoners, such as blood and stool. They would also test their kidney function and collect other varying data. Once they were deemed healthy, then they lost their names and were just assigned a 3-digit number. Whenever a victim died in the unit, a clerk of the 1st Division would just strike their numbers off the index cards that they used to keep track of the victims, and then the deceased person's manacles would just be taken and used on whoever they were bringing in next, so they really didn't care. So, like I said, the cells that the prisoners were kept in, they had these wooden floors and a squat toilet. So, if everybody knows what that is, it's just like a little hole in the floor, you squat over, and there it is. There was a place between the outer walls of the cells and the outer walls of the prison, which allowed the guards to even walk around and all around the cells, behind them and everything. The inner prison was a highly secured building, as you can imagine, complete with cast iron doors, and you even had to have a special permit and an ID pass with a photograph that was required to even enter or exit or anything.
Well, these people weren't screwing around.
No, they weren't. And you had to write down, they had somebody sitting at the doors that wrote down every time somebody went in and every time somebody exited, their exact times, everything of everybody was recorded. The team that worked in this area was known as the special team, and they were clad in these white overalls, army hats, rubber boots, and had pistols strapped to their side. Now, as you can imagine, escape was basically impossible. If a prisoner managed to escape the heavily fortified buildings that were filled with staff, they would then have to get over a roughly 10-foot-high brick wall that was surrounded the complex. And if they managed to get over that, they would then need to cross this dry moat that was filled with electrified wire. So, as you can imagine, nobody ever got out.
I don't imagine so.
And if you got in, you didn't want in. And that happened in Japan, which is crazy to me because you don't hear a lot of stuff like that happening in Japan.
You really don't.
And it's nuts because it rivals what happens with even the Nazis.
Yeah,
I mean, it really does. And I mean, I'm not saying that makes Japan a bad country. I mean, I understand that was, a totally different time and that was different people and that a lot of people may not have even wanted to have been involved in that and didn't even know what was going on.
In my personal philosophy, a country can't or shouldn't be blamed for the actions of a few people.
Right. It shouldn't. And I agree with that. Even like Germany. I mean, I don't think all Germans are bad just because they were Nazis. No, absolutely not. Because, like I said, the majority of people probably didn't even want to be involved or didn't even know what was going on. But it's just so sad that stuff like that went on.
It's so sad and it's so disgusting.
It is. But yes, Unit 731, something that doesn't even sound that bad if someone just said, hey, have you ever heard of Unit 731? You wouldn't think it was going to be all that.
No, you would not.
But anyway, we hope you enjoyed that episode. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. And don't forget to stay disturbed.